All right, good morning, everyone. So since I'm not here, but we still need to get going with notes, I figured I would just record them and you guys can take notes based off of this recording. So we are getting into chapter 9, which you should have read yesterday, which is all about defective agreements. And again, this still goes along with contracts. We're still in like a contract unit. So the learning objectives for this lesson is to describe the mistakes that invalidate a contract, to state what types of mistakes normally do not invalidate contracts, and the third one is to identify the situations in which fraud, duress, or undue influence the present. All right, so one of the first things that we're learning about is mistakes. And there are two different types of mistakes. There is a unilateral mistake as well as a mutual mistake. The unilateral mistake is made by one party to the contract, whereas a mutual mistake is made by both parties to a contract. So, going into mistakes that invalidate contracts, when it comes to mutual mistakes, courts do not find these enforceable, and some courts can find them void or voidable. Hopefully you remember what each of those mean from back in chapter 5 or 6. When it comes to unilateral mistakes, the general rule is that it has no effect on the validity of the contract, but there are a few exceptions among states. Other mistakes that invalidate contracts is the contract's terms. So what those contract's terms govern. So if a contract specifies what happens in the case of a mistake, the contract will apply if law does not provide anything. The contract is what the parties agreed to orally, even if written it says something else, which I believe is a little bit different than what you might have thought. So figured I would share that with you. And then on the flip side, there are some mistakes that do not invalidate contracts. So when it comes to unilateral mistakes, generally they have no effect on the contract at all. And mutual mistakes are generally make the contract invalid. But there are always exceptions. So there's, I think, four exceptions. So the first one is the value, quality, or price. So basically what this is saying is if, let's say, you sold a ring and you sold it for $50 thinking that it was just something kind of cheap, not like super expensive, and then you can't make a complaint later if you realize that the jewel is like $2,500. It was sold at that price, that's what you sold it for, so you can't really do anything about that. The second one is with the terms of the contract. So basically, if there's a misunderstanding with the contract's meaning, or if there's something significant that was failed to be mentioned in the written part, that could be one of those. The next type of mutual mistake can come with the law. So usually the law makes the contract fully binding, so parties should be able to know what the law entails around that. And then the fourth one is mistakes to expectations. So this could be like when parties to a contract are mutually mistaken as to their expectations. The contract is still binding when it comes to that. All right, so moving on in the chapter, we're getting into fraud. So there are a couple different types of fraud. The first one is fraud in the inducement. So this is basically when a party intended to make a contract based on a false statement of terms or obligations of transactions. So then the contract is voidable. The next type is fraud in the execution. So this is like a defrauded party did not intend to sign a contract when nature of writing could not be understood. So the nature of that writing was not really able to understand. So that contract is void. Again, there are differences between voidable and void. There's also active fraud. So a party engages in action that causes the fraud. There are 4 different elements of fraud. The first one is misrepresentation. So it's like a false statement of a fact of some sorts. There's also, then the second one is that it must be made, by one who knew it to be false or made it in reckless disregard of its truth or falsity. There's also, then the third one is that it must be made with the intent to induce the innocent party to act. And the fourth element is that the innocent party justifiably relies on the false statement and makes a contract based off of that fraud. There is also passive fraud. So if a relationship is based on trust and confidence, silence may be constituted as passive fraud, but remember that silence is not fraud. So if the silence isn't a fraudulent behavior, then it could be constituted as passive fraud. But we've talked about how silence can be even an acceptance of an offer as well. So that's kind of a tricky one to maybe wrap your head around. The next type is innocent misrepresentation. So this is still a type of fraud. There was a false statement made in belief that it is true. So it wasn't misrepresented on purpose. In that case, the contract is voidable. There's also statements of opinion. So the opinion does not constitute fraud, but a misstatement of valued opinion can amount to fraud. All right, moving on to duress. There are a few different types of duress as well, just like there was for fraud and mistakes. So the first type is physical duress. So this is when one party threatens the other with physical violence into a contract. So you can't threaten someone by punching them. That is unlawful. There's also emotional duress. So one party's threat affects the psychological ability of the other to act under a free will. The next is economic duress. So this is when one party financially threatens the other into a contract. This does not occur when one of the party members has difficult financial circumstances or one party member drives a hard bargain to take advantage of the urgency of the other party. All right, and then when it comes to undue influence, undue influence is a person in a special relationship causes another's actions contrary to free will. So contracts under that situation are voidable. There are then remedies for a breach of contract due to fraud, duress, or undue influence. So these 3 different mistakes can render contracts avoidable. So they could also be rescinded, which is to set the contract aside and return what you received under the contract. So you can rescind the contract offer, essentially. And that is it when it comes to notes. Thanks for listening.